Hello, I'm David Smith, a Chinese to English translator. In this video we're going to talk a little bit more about the history of Chinese. Last video we looked at the prehistory of the language. Now we're moving on to much firmer ground and we're going to look at Old Chinese. When it comes to Old Chinese, we don't have any CDs or DVDs of how people used to speak. So what we have to do is start with Middle Chinese and work our way back. Poems are really useful here. If we find a poem and we know how it rhymed, we only need to work out a couple of the words and we're able to work out how the other words were sounding. And luckily, one of the best materials from the period is literally called the Classic of Poetry. It was compiled by Confucius in about 4 BC, I believe, but it's actually a compilation of a lot of poems dating way back to 900 BC. Let's take the Chinese character Ming, which means bright. In that case, the sound comes at the beginning of the character, so we call that the initial and the ing comes at the end, so we call that the final of the character. Modern Standard Chinese has 7 vowels. If we go back a bit earlier to Middle Chinese, we think there were 6 vowels, and if we go back even further to Old Chinese, the subject of our video, we find there were even fewer vowels. Both Modern Chinese and Old Chinese have something called a nasal initial, which is a kind of sound where it goes through the nose. There's 2 types of nasal initial. You can do it with your voice box activated, kind of like or with your voice box kind of resting, which is like Voiceless nasal initials are super cool. They don't actually happen in many languages. There's one in Welsh, I believe, in this expression. No, I'm not even going to try and say it, but it means my head in Welsh. And there's another one which in the E language means cuckoo tree, and it's spelled HMA. Old Chinese also had voiceless nasal initials. We do not think Old Chinese had tones. We know that they came in somehow. So what do we think happened? Well, let's look at a good example. Let's look at words in Tibetan from the same period and compare them with words from Chinese from that period, right? So Old Tibetan and Old Chinese. We know there's a bunch of words in Old Tibetan that ended with consonant clusters. If you think of a word like breath, B-R-E-A-T-H in English, just imagine saying it, breath, breath. If you kind of break it down over time, breath, 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 you can kind of see how a consonant cluster can kind of break over time. I'm talking over hundreds of years. Let's look at these 4 characters. For various reasons I won't go into, we know they probably rhymed, and we've got an idea that they were pronounced bing, lin, lin, lin. Now, we know they probably sounded the same in Old Chinese. What process could possibly explain that additional B? One of the best theories is that if all 4 of them used to be pronounced with BL at the beginning, blur, and then over time, like that mechanism I mentioned, blur became blur, ba, la, ba, la, ba, la. And before you know it, the ba part then gets lost. So you just end up with some of them with the l and with a couple of them with the b in place. Finally, let's talk about tones. Many words in Old Chinese that are pronounced with the ru tone are cognates with, remember that word, cognates? They sound a lot like Tibetan words that ended with the letter S. If you imagine a word like can, C-A-N, the English word can, and then cans, cans. See how when I say the S, my tone kind of naturally goes down because I'm going further into my throat? Cans, cans. You could also do cans, cans. But can you see how changing the syllable can kind of change the tone of your voice? Maybe after a long enough period of time, instead of hearing the Z letter, people started to get used to the tone rising or the tone falling at the end of the syllable. Can and can. And that was the beginning of the development of Chinese tones. And of course, the same process didn't happen in Old Tibetan, and they still kept the letter S on the end. In Chinese, because the tone started to convey the information, people kind of got lazy and stopped pronouncing the S. Alright, that's a very quick introduction to Old Chinese. If you want to come back and join me for the next video, we're going to talk about Middle Chinese. I'm David Smith, a Chinese to English translator. Learn more about me at davidsmithtranslation.com. Bye.